Paul, thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, let's get going. I think today is quite an exciting one because it certainly gets down to the brass tacks in terms of what we are expected to do as data management professionals. So really encourage you guys to ask questions and debate in terms of what we want to do. Now, the reason I think it's important is I and one of my customers, I spent about 3 months building job profiles and professional levels and things like that, which was rather painful at the time, but I'm actually very thankful now. And when I look at things like the context diagram on the DMBOK, it's a case of who should be doing what. So I don't know how many of us are involved, intimately involved in metadata. Any metadata specialists that are on the call, it would be interesting to get your feedback in terms of how you guys structure and what the expectations are for the different levels that you have within your organization. So keen to do that. Okay, great. So we've done metadata for managers, metadata for citizens, and now we'll be tackling metadata for professionals. We will be dealing with the last one in terms of metadata for executives next week, and then the month after that, well, the month of July, we'll be focusing on data architecture. So I certainly, we spend quite a bit of time building questions for the data architecture exam. So nice to go through it and just present in terms of what we've been doing in that area. So data architecture exams are coming up, and it'll be good to chat. All right, so this is from a data management professional level. It's not as all the different aspects that we had with data citizenship. It's a lot simpler, but more detailed. And I'd like to just start off with the job professional levels, or the professional job levels. That's more important. And I sort of broken it up into entry, professional, specialist, and thought leader. And these are my definitions in terms of what an entry job level is. That's almost starting out in metadata. And for some time, I used the term intern. And then Veronica kept on saying, but that sounds more like a graduate. So this could be anybody that's had experience within the data management area, but now wants to focus on metadata itself and specializing metadata. So you basically, in a way, starting out. Now, part of what I've defined here is progression criteria. And I had to do this in terms of my job profiles. I had to basically define the knowledge, skills, and competencies and attitudes. And one of them would be to move into a professional, we expect a level of data management certification, and I call it operational KSCA. So in your context diagrams, where you see operational activities, we are expecting that, you know, before you become a professional, or you leave that entry level, you can run the operational side of metadata management. Okay, great. So there on the bottom right-hand side, this was a series of levels built by, or HR levels that are built by PwC and a few of the different management consultants. We are focusing at this professional level here. So it's entry, intermediate, experienced, advanced, and expert. I can use some of them. The expert pretty much ties into what I refer to as a thought leader, and this intermediate and experienced and advanced, I battle to apply that. So what I've done is used almost the professional when you get your CDMP certification at a fundamental level, and then a specialist is when you've completed the exam on metadata. Anybody done that? Anyone achieved a metadata specialist exam? No. Okay, great. I'm sure we should be seeing a few more, hopefully. So from a professional point of view, we expect that person to be able to guide and control, almost defining assurance of the data management activity. So they should be able to guide people in terms of how they do metadata, and then also provide that almost second level of assurance. So the professional I tend to see probably sitting at the EIM level with data governance and the ability to define and to manage and to help us implement here. Okay, and then the specialist is the ability to develop controls for data management. And that would be the definition of policies, standards, the P3, and to an extent the T. So it's principles, policies, and procedures. And the sort of progression there is that you'd be a community of practice leader within metadata. The thought leader, now you can still have, and I still believe the thought leader is important within an organization. You may not consider yourself to be a global community of practice, but you are able to set the direction for metadata within your organization. So you're the person that's going to be expected to build the strategies, the metadata strategies. And then, of course, you got to link it to the data strategy and the data governance strategies as well. Okay, so that's sort of my definition of the different job levels. It's important to have that. You want to show people a progression path. And what I like doing is then taking the DMBOK activities, the deliverables and inputs, and allocating responsibility. And the one that I find the most important is that can I allocate roles and responsibilities about the creation of deliverables? We may call the processes differently, but we tend to call the deliverables the same. So do we have a metadata strategy? Do we have standards? Do we have an architecture? Do we have a meta model? Do we have unified metadata? Metadata stores, data lineage. So these things, lots of us can agree on these things that will probably be customized within your organization, but it's still helpful to have a starting point. So from my point of view, I see the thought leader as the person responsible for defining the strategy and understanding the business user requirements for metadata and how would that get resolved. And you'll notice then that I've allocated the specialist as someone who handles the technical user requirements, the initiation of the metadata architecture, and then the professional is someone that's going to be applying metadata standards, defining and applying. The intern is that person that's almost going to be doing the repository management and bringing the data together and looking after whatever technology you're using, is ensuring that data has been loaded from whichever site or whatever, depending on your architecture, they will be hands-on involved with the metadata. Okay, and then we have a professional, which is that person that will almost be looking at how effective is your metadata. So how effective is your ability to do a search? How effective is to report and analyze the metadata? So there's a question from Ruth. She's a librarian at Petroleum Agency. Our library is now using Laserfish, where one has to catalog all the books and other research materials. I just need clarity on metadata as I'm still trying to find our way in the metadata world. So it's a good question, Ruth. Thanks for asking. So when you catalog the books, the book you could almost see as a data set itself, but the manner in which it's cataloged. Sorry, Paul Bolton, will you just mute the person? Thanks. Okay, so the cataloging, that almost the ISN number that you have for a piece of research would be considered to be metadata, or what context or what tags are associated with that piece of research. So whenever you do a lookup on research or you find a paper, there's a whole lot of tags that describe and content, but you'll see a little bit further on where I give you a lot more details about that type of what the metadata is. Ruth, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, great. Okay, so here I see as inputs, I believe the professional, I allocated that person the data governance metadata, those almost the controls. The specialist I had as doing the metadata architecture. The intern was the person collecting all the metadata, the technical metadata, and the thought leader was the person gathering the business requirements and providing a strategy and a way of dealing with those requirements. All right. So now if we go to this DMBOK metadata summary, this is what Veronica's built to create a complete summary of the DMBOK chapter. And I really like being able to just allocate those roles to the different areas. And if we look at that, the data manager must be paying attention to all of these areas. They don't always need to know how to do it, but they need to know that it's being done. All right, so Ruth, here's another example of metadata for unstructured data, which is where you're sitting in. There's descriptive, structural, administrative, bibliographic, record-keeping metadata, and preservation metadata. Okay, so there's our data manager. These are the things we spoke about last week with the data citizen, focusing on their responsibility of adding metadata for the documents that they create or whatever it is, that create and maintain metadata. The data citizen is also involved in helping us establish the data lineage, the impact analysis, and with risk and readiness, different assessments there. Now comes the complicated part where we take the rest of these and we apply our professionals to those areas. So the intern is the person that's applying the standards. So the professional / specialist, they've defined the standards and the intern's got to now apply them to all the metadata that we have. The professional is responsible for almost managing the metadata standards, either defining them and making sure that they're up to date. They're responsible for looking at the sources of metadata, and they're responsible for dealing with the areas of governance of metadata. And then I go to the specialist, which is defining the metadata architecture, creating a meta model. And here we have the different elements of the metadata architecture, centralized, distributed, and we'll talk through that. And then we go to the thought leader that's dealing with defining a metadata strategy and understanding the metadata requirements that should guide the metadata strategy. So sometimes these points are there's a chicken and egg situation is I typically need to understand the requirements before I define the metadata strategy. Similar to a data strategy, I need to understand the business value chain, the business architecture, the business data estate before I can define the data strategy. All right, are there any questions in terms of the expectations that I have of these different roles? So,
yes, I have a question.
Yes.
If a piece of metadata can that play multiple roles?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, Debs, it's a good question in terms of, could you have a piece of metadata that's both descriptive and structural and bibliographic, as an example? Yes, that's possible. And so we have to be careful about having these pigeonholes. Metadata is one of those funny areas where a piece of metadata could actually belong to multiple different types of metadata or roles that metadata play. And I'll get to a slide a little bit further on where I start to use something that a guy by the name of George Firican in Canada. I'm sure everyone's seen him and heard him on those presentations. He's a little bit like Scott Taylor, but also very dynamic. And he's introduced this idea of what is the role of metadata and can we break them up? So we'll go through some examples there. But good question.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Now, this is a question for Veronica, and I wondered if she's listed this as a challenge. So in the DMBOK, in chapter 1.3, in section 1.3.6 of the metadata chapter, they refer to all the architectural layers point to the metadata lifecycle. So on the right-hand side, we spoke about that a bit with the data citizen. The basic lifecycle is plan, design and enable, create the metadata, store the metadata in a central repository or distributed repositories, and then make use of the metadata and then enhance the metadata. And then we've got a different level of disposal. But when you look at that section of 1.3.6, one of the things that they don't bring in is these two phases over here, which is plan, design, and enable. So they don't talk about the modeling of metadata. They go straight into the metadata creation. And it sort of reminds us of the way we do build databases. We go straight into the physical layer and we start building the design itself. Veronica?
We do?
No, I'm saying that's what, if you look at the DMBOK chapter on 136, they don't include metadata modeling.
No, they don't, not at all. Although they do, when you get to the activities, they talk about creating the meta model, but that's all they do.
Yes. Now, so basically what we're saying here in times of this metadata lifecycle, they've ignored the first two, plan and design and enable. Thomas?
Yeah, so what is metadata modeling? Because you caught me now, because when you create, let's say, the database model, we know DBAs don't, they go in and start creating tables, but let's assume they've gone the full thing, they've done the meta model, because that's then metadata creation. So I kind of understand why plan and design is skipped, because by modeling, you're actually creating.
Right.
So what is purely metadata modeling then?
Okay, so metadata modeling is and there was quite a nice discussion that we had on LinkedIn describing metadata modeling to somebody. And if we think of, if we are going to bring metadata from all the different sources of metadata, so for example, Erwin, I go and design a data model of the business. And then I've got a business glossary. And I go and design and I go and build a business glossary tool that has business glossary data. Now, the design of almost the tables that keep that data is where your metadata sits. So if you know SQL Server, you can go select star from information schema.columns, and it will return you all the columns. Or you can go from tables. So when you look at information schema dot, you'll see tables, constraints, columns. So that's metadata of the data.
Yeah, I'm happy there, but
so a meta model would describe the relationships between the fact that a table contains columns, a column contains constraints and relationships and foreign keys. And so a meta model is a data model, but it's now modeling metadata and not the physical data that we have. Now, both of them are levels of physical, but now, and the important thing is metadata, depending on your view, it may be perceived as data or metadata. But so if you, Thomas, I'm not sure if I've answered your question there.
It's okay. It's a one I'll ponder. It's a good one. Thanks.
Yeah. So a meta model, and especially if you think of unifying meta models. So if I go into Erwin, for example, and I go and ask it for its meta model of all the data models, all the ERDs. Okay.
Yes.
It's going to come back to me with a whole lot of rows and entities that describe the fact that you had a customer and you created an entity and you created a relationship, and what were the constraints and what's the cardinality. That is your meta model.
Okay, with you. Thank you.
Okay. Now the interesting thing is when you talk about a unified meta model, for example, you may have metadata that we've stored in a data catalog about all our data assets, where they sit, what the content is and things like that. And then you bring a data model that comes from Owen. You want to be able to join these elements together. And so that's what we refer to as a unified meta model, where we're bringing data across all the different areas. So if I was to say to you, what happens if I change this design or this ERD, then who would I impact? Would I impact the data assets here? Would I impact the SQL database there? Would I impact the Power BI over here? So all of that metadata that we've collected from all these different sources, I need to be able to link together so that when we ask the question, if I change something, what's impacted, I can give you an answer. Otherwise, the metadata is not really playing the role that it needs to bring together. Okay.
All right, thank you.
And so here you've got, so I've labeled here the unification of metadata. So when we bring metadata together from various repositories, how do we load them into something called where we have an enterprise data model? Can we have an enterprise meta model? And I always remember doing some work for architects when we used Casewise, and they didn't have a data quality component where we could look at all of the results of our profiling. When we profiled the data asset, I had to build a meta model within Casewise to be able to store the fact that I had this data asset, I had this data quality expectation, I had these profile results, and this had this problem, and I needed to link it to the ER diagram for the different assets that we had. So it's about bringing it all together. Now, there's actually there's another level there where you can go to a meta model, which is another stretch of the imagination. Not easy to build a meta model, but just have a quick look on Google and you'll see that concept of a meta model as well. Okay, so our metadata usage is about searching. So this is where we're getting into here. We're searching at this level, and enhancing is when we unify and we bring them all together. And of course, we've got to have standardized, and we've got to bring all this together. Carl, your question, Casewise corporate modeler is end of life. Yes. It had a, I don't know what happened to it, but it seemed to fall off the wagon. Okay, so if I go to the types of metadata architecture, I think this is really important. This is where we're going to be building, at this level, we're going to be building an enterprise, we're going to be creating a meta model, right? Where we bring in metadata from the BI tools. So when do they last refresh? What visualizations do they have? What's the access control? All of those type of things that BI tools give. We've got modeling tools, Irwin, ERD, all the different areas, ETL tools. We know how these ETL tools move data. And I'm sure there are a few of you on here that work with Ab Initio, and that's got something called a Meta Hub, and that stores metadata, and you can then query the metadata for the operational metadata that's been generated during the ETL process. Now, what you can see with this diagram is that it presents a metadata portal to the users. They can query it. Now, in the background or whatever it is, whatever date, the repository actually goes to the BI tools. For example, it will go to SSRS, the Power BI server. It will query all of the reports. What happened? So it will query all the reports that are in that SSRS report server. And it will do with the ETLs, so all my sys packages, all those stuff, the database management tools, the reference data, it will go to my master data systems, data quality tools. Can you see all of the extent of the metadata that's coming together? And then, Thomas, another thing that knowledge, for example, is also metadata about the data that we have. What is the context that we're working in? So advantages of a centralized environment, high availability, quick retrieval. The data is then picked up at batch hours, very similar to an analysis server where it's processed in the evening. But the problem that we get into, some of the limitations, is that we can be slow in updating the real state of where we're at. Okay, so the quick replication of this metadata is not an easy task. Then we go into a distributed metadata architecture where there is no repository. Okay, so this is almost what we're looking at here is virtual metadata. When you issue the query onto the metadata portal, it will go to all of these different tools and issue a query and come back. Now, I'm sure you guys are asking, what sort of query, what are we talking about? There's a language called Sparkle that they use with catalogs, and they query these different repositories, and then all we need is that these tools can answer those metadata queries. So what is the limitation here? Well, the limitation is that you lose that ability that you have in the centralized repository. So you lose the ability for users to annotate the metadata that's contained within the enterprise metadata repository. So users can't go and add their metadata and can't collaborate on it. So, you know, what do I think of this? When did this happen? What were the possible root cause? How are these two related? They can't do that because it's really just a query system. So it's automated query processing. Is quite a bit simple, but they can't leave the metadata there. And the quality of the metadata depends on the source system. So if I've got a source system that's giving me bad metadata, I can't do anything about it when a user searches for that metadata. Okay. Then we go to the hybrid approach. And what we're doing in the hybrid approach is that we can now add the user-added metadata, the discussion around that. What then can happen is metadata is current and as valid as possible at the time of use, and then it's basically a scenario where the BI tools are and the different tools are pushing the metadata into the repository. So that's where that line goes over there. Okay, so we've now got almost the best of both worlds that we're sitting with. So helpful when you put these things together. Okay, so that's sort of at an architecture level. Then when you need to discuss or understand how to go and ask for metadata requirements, and a lot of these metadata requirements that we're seeing here are technical metadata requirements, and they're more simplistic than understanding what our subject area model is of the organization, the types of data catalogs that we have. So it doesn't talk too much about that level, but what it is saying at a certain element, when you go and review the actual schemas, you've got to look at volatility. So what's the update frequency? Okay, so if it's a very volatile scenario, then and data assets, data catalog are changing very quickly, then you want to be careful of going for a centralized because you're going to miss the changes. Very similar to the debates you have with BI. Synchronization, how often are we going to get the updates into the centralized repository? History, do we have versions of it similar to master data? Are we versioning the models that we pick up? Something like GitHub or whatever it is. Then access rights, so who can access the information, structure, what is the meta model for that, and the storage, integration, maintenance, management, quality, and security. Okay, so Connie asked the question, Sparkle as in RDF query language or a different kind of Sparkle? No, you got it 100% correct. Sparkle's used for a really powerful, a lot of your open data platforms are using Sparkle, spelled SPARQL, and the ability to route those queries to the original countries that have got the data set, and they can be resolved there as well. Okay, so this is just some of the techniques of doing a metadata strategy. I didn't want to go too far in this in terms of just the planning for the strategy, key stakeholder interviews, access existing metadata sources and information architecture, develop future metadata architecture, and then develop the phase implementation strategy. That's typically what you'll do. And of course, you're getting involved with the metadata specialist that will help you with the metadata architecture. And I see the same thing when I build a data strategy. I've got to be working with the data architecture to build that understanding of the subject area model. Okay, so that just gives us an overview of the essential concepts or the description of what the DMBOK has to say about metadata, just the principles, the smallest element that we have. And now let's go into a little bit more detail about what the data management professionals need to do. And this is what I really found interesting today in terms of the roles of metadata. So it's interesting that the DMBOK, I don't know if you guys have noticed that, there are categories of metadata, and that's descriptive, administrative, that's what you got in that section 1.3.5.6. And then you've got the types of metadata being business metadata, operational metadata, process metadata, and technical metadata. Now, what George came along with, and he added this idea of the roles of metadata. So what roles does metadata play within the organization? And I really like this way of thinking about it, because I can then, when I understand the role that metadata is playing within my organization, I can then allocate this work to the roles that I have of metadata professionals. All right. So what I'm wanting to do here is to say, okay, which metadata professional is going to look after classification? Which metadata professional is going to look after description, guidance, and control? Okay. So if we look at what the way George has described that, is that we have a classification metadata. So metadata can be used to classify data, and there's the different ways in which you can classify data according to the subject, the business subject, the usage, the time, the content that it contains, and then the scope of that metadata. And I'll share a link. I've got a whole lot of URLs that I've gathered a lot of this information, and I can share that with you as well. And it's helpful just to go through that. And then we have the description metadata. So when metadata needs to describe something, needs to describe the content, it can be used to describe the values or the domain that a column has of the data values, and the data lineage in terms of where the data came from. Okay. And then we have.
Sorry, I don't know if it was just me, but the sound cut out.
Okay. So did you not hear about description?
Rewind 15 seconds.
15 seconds. Okay, that was on data lineage, right?
Maybe.
Okay. All right. So descriptive metadata is probably the metadata that we understand the most. Whenever we get to Excel, for example, we're going to have a look at some of the column headings. We're going to have a look at the tabs, and we start to describe the data that we have in that spreadsheet. What is the meaning? What is the data structure? If I do VLOOKUPs, or if I have relationships between different tabs, what is the content? So if I have a data asset, what does the content look like? How do I describe the content? And then if I have a column, what are the set of permissible values? And of course, when you do that with data quality, you'd say, what is dirty data? What should be in that domain and what shouldn't be in that domain? Is null an acceptable value? Or capital, the uppercase and the lowercase, is there a difference? Are they all the same? And a good example there would be ISO currency. So we then have ISO describing the currency. So what would be used to describe a currency called ZAR? How do we associate other attributes that give us context on the ZAR? And then we have data lineage, and that's the path that the data flows through. All right, then we have guidance in terms of, and I added this term search. So if I'm trying to guide our business users into the finding of data or describing how to use data, then I'm looking at this concept of building keywords, tags. That's the sort of stuff in LinkedIn, in Twitter, all the keywords, research documents, they have keywords. If I'm gonna improve my search engine, that I could find any piece of data or even metadata, how would I do it? And then taxonomy in terms of the structuring. And then I've got control metadata that's going to help me with regulation, retention, and service level. Okay, so one of the things that Debbie asked earlier on is, can I have a piece of metadata that sits across multiple areas? And yes, the answer is certainly. If I have an area of data lineage, I can then link it to the regulation of data privacy. I could also then link it to cross-border or the different risks. So I could have one piece of metadata about my data asset, and it's applied in multiple areas. And it could have content about the subject or the classification of the asset. So metadata about my customer database or my customer table, I could be resolving several different issues. But I didn't want to complicate it. What I'm trying to share here is that I can break these roles up into the different areas. And when I want to understand how to classify my data, then I use the classification. If I want to be able to describe my data, if I want to be able to search on the data, what do I need to look at? And if I want to be able to control my data in different levels, then that's a different role. Is anyone comfortable with that? I might drop data quality metadata in somewhere. Yeah, that's certainly, for example, service level, Paul. I think is that Paul Krobler? Within the service levels, for example, if I have a data quality profile expectation, then if the data comes in and doesn't meet that expectation, then I'd have a challenge with the service level. Now, I could also have data structure there as well. For example, referential integrity or foreign keys. Okay, so that would also be, and then data values, for example, that would be, is null a valid value or is it not? Okay. So Carl, when you ask about an ETL hub, will carry such. Now, ETL tends to be your operational ETL. What it does contain in some cases, it contains rules, business rules, and transformation mappings, and then that can be used as well to bring in a different area here. For example, data meaning. Yeah, Paul. So, for example, the trustworthiness of data, that could be a service level. I think that could be described. This list of elements is not complete. I think what I was just trying to show you is what I really like is this sort of grouping or this taxonomy structure of the roles, classification, description, guidance, and control. Okay. Now, I must admit, when I first saw this, this is Donna Burbank, and she created this in 2017. I loved it. Of course, I enjoyed the 5 wives and the husband, and I knew that when I was preparing for this talk that I would make use of this. And then I went and read George Firican's thing, and I then discovered how many things I was missing. So I started to do a mapping in the last couple of days, in the last week, to say, okay, this data, these elements over here are my classification elements. Okay, and then when I look at description elements, it covers these different questions and the elements over here. So it describes who created this data, who's the steward of this data, who is using this data, who owns this data. That's descriptive metadata. And then I've got also what are the technical naming standards for the database implementation. Again, descriptive metadata. And then the next one was, these are controls. So how long should it be stored? So that's always, remember, we refer to as retention and disposal and regulation. These are areas over here. And then control is also who is regulating or auditing this data. There's control. Are there regional privacy, control, and then this one as well, there's an area of control. And what I'm trying to describe here is just showing you how I can get similar metadata elements that are overlapping in terms of the role of the metadata. But what I was really fascinated about was that I was completely missing guidance and search. And it took me a while of thinking about this and wondering whether I was wrong. And then when I sort of look at the date that we got, it's almost 5 years back now. So all that metadata searching, the ontologies and the taxonomies and that's something that's really just started to become recognized and powerful, and people are building that at this point in time. So I just get the feeling that that was probably something that wasn't described, that wasn't really a hot topic at that point in time. Okay, are there any questions, observations in terms of this? Everyone's quiet. Am I losing you, or is it making sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think on your guidance and search one, I'm kind of questioning. So, I mean, SharePoint is the typical thing that comes to mind when you talk about tags and taxonomies. And SharePoint has definitely been around since 2017. I think what's probably happened is knowledge management and metadata has become a lot more intertwined, maybe since 2017.
Right. That's a good observation, Thomas. When I first saw the slide, I thought it was fantastic. It gave me so many things to think about when I defined metadata, when I looked at what the possible attributes were, and then just by looking at what George had done in terms of the role of metadata, it was another level of application that I hadn't worked through. So. And then I went the next level further to say, okay, now that I've sort of got these roles of metadata, what of Donna's could I use and map back? And this was the sort of thing of these are the ones that she had certainly found and identified. And then these were the ones that weren't identified within that area. So really nice if you keep the 5 wives and 2 husbands, not just one husband, then you have a really nice way of breaking down the possible metadata elements and the roles and the different things that you have to look after. So then I went back to the same diagram that I did for the data citizens. So we've got, these are our different roles or focus areas. So how do we classify information? How do we describe information? How do we guide people in terms of understanding what data and information is there, and then how do we control it? So nice simple way of doing it. And then this is the 5 wives and 2 husbands in terms of saying, okay, from a classification point of view, I've got all of these questions that I need to answer, description. And then of course I added the knowledge management, which is exactly the same as that I added for change management and data citizenship. We still, from a professional point of view, we need to get that tacit and explicit knowledge in, but I focused on these 4 areas at the top. Okay, so I hope you can see that this one, I've just realized now it's not a great color scheme. I should have made those black. And so this is the way that I've now mapped that on to my professional role. So for example, entry, they would be dealing a lot with descriptive metadata. Okay, so they would really be able to be collecting the descriptive metadata, what's in the different databases, how do I describe a data asset in terms of the columns and things like that. And they would also be involved in doing providing metadata issue support. So if any of my users were battling to find data or to describe data, then an entry person would be good at helping that. The professional was there in terms of control. They would play a role of a meta modeler. And notice how I've separated between the professional and the specialist. I see the specialist as the person that would look wider with that classification. They would typically be seen as a person who built a unified meta model. Then I've got an architect, as a specialist, and an ontologist. And the professional metadata person, they would be involved in assurance. So they would be involved on projects, just doing review gates in terms of, is the right metadata going to be produced? Everything from a business glossary to the description of the assets to the data models, they would be doing that assurance level. That's very much hands-on in terms of being integral part of a lot of the projects. And they would help us just ensure that the standards have been applied and they manage the standards and the feedback on the standards. And then the thought leader, from a guidance point of view, I see that person as performing the strategist role within the organization, and then the global practice leader. Okay. So that's the sort of short rundown of our data management professionals. Any questions, anything that you'd like to discuss with respect to a metadata professional?
Hey, Howard, it's Mark.
Yeah, Mark.
Have you come across people who do this really well?
No.
Okay, good. I don't feel so bad.
So what I do find is that, and a good example of that is we've got some good data modelers, but then it's that almost that looking after the data models, using the meta model, and then bringing it together to build a search engine. That sort of metadata repository, I haven't seen a lot of growth in that area. But if we look at, so if we take, for example, the open data platforms, those guys that are building data catalogs, building data quality assessments of the data, so those people that are really providing a service around data, I see that their metadata is a lot more up to date. But the interesting thing is they don't almost have a data model of the data assets that they have. So, you know, if we were to go around the DMBOK, just about every single chapter has metadata. Are we seeing a comprehensive view of that? So we'll see good stuff done by SharePoint, for example, in terms of some of the tagging and the taxonomies. And even then, those taxonomies are not always well managed. You know, some that are good, and I know that some areas pay a lot of attention to that, the tagging taxonomy within SharePoint, but I haven't seen a lot of really well managed metadata areas out there. Is anyone else? Okay. Paul, have you got I see your hands up?
Yes. Hi, Howard. By the way, the other Paul guest is not me, so there's 3 Pauls on the call now.
Oh, Jesus, I'm not sure which one it is. Yeah. Just rename yours to PG.
Yeah, yeah, I should. So this topic was always the most the least attractive for me in the whole of DMBOK.
Even less attractive than security and.
Well, security is records management.
Okay.
If I have to single out one of the things, you know, that's still, oh boy. All right. Anyway, but so this was foreign to me. I mean, even the concepts that you presented now, it was for me pretty untangible until I had to learn how some of the Informatica products work around this. So my context was in the pre-sales environment for Ultron, and you know, we sort of just I had to learn the stack a little bit. But then a lot of these concepts only dropped. The penny dropped for me only then. If I look at some of the things out there like Axon or Informatica EDC, and I know there's others as well.
Yeah.
These products, I couldn't really, sort of really make sense of where the practical application is, apart from you have to do it and it's good governance, etc. But the one thing that sort of jumps out for me a lot is the concept of data marketplaces.
Oh yes, that open data platform. Yeah, they.
Yeah, well, so you can, you can apply that to your own.
Yes, agreed. It shouldn't be restricted to open.
Yes, but that's when I realized how powerful metadata management really is.
Yeah.
And especially if that leads into things like papaya compliance and so on. It went from something that's a pretty much an obscure concept for me until it grew up in this point where it's really crucial to get this right. Even if you do it right in pockets, it's a big thing to just tackle. But if your purpose is clear and you've got a good reason to do it, you will put the necessary effort into doing it right.
Yeah.
Data marketplaces is one of the things where I thought this is not only something that helps me understand it, it's really cool, to have a concept of I go to a place, I search for data, it comes back in a sort of almost an AWS or a take-a-lot or a whatever form. You have products to choose from, you can see data quality, ratings, you can see who owns it, etc. And to get that right, we often sort of jump to SharePoint, and I like to criticize any Microsoft apps whenever I can, as you know.
Yes.
But I agree, it did grow quite a bit in the last while. But you have to really have good scanning technology to go and troll and get a lot of that metadata out. As you mentioned, it's not only databases and so on, it's the ETL tools, it's modeling tools. A lot of them are able to answer those kind of queries. But to actually still get that together, bring it back into a place where it's meaningful for people. It's actually means something apart from sitting in a repository somewhere. So I guess my point is just that if you approach the metadata management stream of activities, let's just put it that way, and you connect it clearly to being able to service your user base well. In other words, all of this is nothing for them if they can't just go to a place and find the data that they need. It's one of the simple cases, but that's really where the rubber hits the road, right?
100%. It's got to be about that, and it's also got to be about the control. So that idea of there's so much data around, and if you can't control its usage, you're going to pick up problems as well. Just today, sitting on listening to Veronica and some of them, some people are now so scared of the self-service analytical tools that they've actually taken an approach of banning their use when it comes to PII information. So they're basically saying, when you're dealing with privacy information, then you can't use a self-service analytical tool. So that's where you don't want to be in that game where you start pulling the handbrake and you start slowing people down in terms of the use of the data. It's got to be elevating it and making use of AI and machine learning to automatically catalog the data, to describe the data, so to classify, describe, and then to have an understanding of whether I can use it to control. So we got to get a lot better, and there are things that are going on like that. I've seen some great tools. Solidatus is doing some of it, linking stuff to regulatory taxonomies, linking data elements, data lineage. But we have to bring it all together. At the end of the day, is not just about the control. It's about, can the user find and understand and develop meaning of the data? Pretty much what we got with the data citizen. That's critical. But let's, Thomas, you've got something to share, and then Anthony.
I think Anthony was first.
Anthony, audio, sir.
Let's go. Hi, everybody.
Hi, Anthony.
So I think in a big organization and data scattered all over, one of the biggest challenges we've been having is showing business value at possibly or value at a product level. Whenever you have to introduce a tool to manage, something like metadata, the question is, you're sitting with the MEs, the likes, to say, well, guys, show me the uplift in terms of either revenue or maybe from a cost to income ratio, dropping that or something like that. So I think that is the biggest challenge from that. I hear I hear one of the guys talking about Informatica and stuff like that. I mean, we've canned Informatica not long ago, but once again, it's about usage of the tool and proving its worth in the business.
Yeah. Look, Anthony, your comment is applicable to just about any tool that we bring along, be it from just building a data model, Irwin, whatever it is. People are asking the question of what value do I get out of this? Case-wise, data architecture, architectural diagrams. There's lots of questions happening about, am I getting value out of that discipline that's just really focused on the plan and design? It is a challenge. But are you specifically saying that metadata is you're finding it really difficult to validate or justify the value of metadata?
Well, with the exception of the POPIA related or the PI type of stuff, because that was the easy, that was the easy one. You don't have it, you're going to get a fine. The rest of it, yes.
Yeah, you see, so I mean, the one thing that I used it on a lot is BCBS 239. And remember when BCBS changed from Basel 3 to 239, all of a sudden 239, you couldn't PowerPoint program your data lineage. And so then it was quite instrumental on having all of that metadata together, understanding what the transformations, what rules, so that it actually, at the end of the day, when it came to the balance sheet, the CFO had to be able to sign that and not get into a situation where he couldn't see what had happened and what translated in that process. So I found metadata in that area, and that's where I actually got involved first with Metadata Hub. We had to build a simplified or aggregated view of all the financials moving from the product system through to the online report, and to be able to give an expression of what the transformation is, what the latency is, and things like that.
So, you're right. In terms, from an other perspective of BCBS, I think there we went at a very nice level, so we got data. And, when POPIA came along, it was whether we could scale that solution to meet the POPIA or GDPR solution. But once again, the ask from a POPIA perspective is slightly different, because lesser focus on the technical metadata, but rather at a term or, like at a field level, and, in the flow of data. So then it was a quick, I mean, there you probably can get away with a SharePoint thing.
Yeah.
But, justifying its existence or, putting a business case to scale the existing solution to cater for all the other data is actually becoming a challenge right now.
Right, and I mean, one thing I can share with you is the use of a business glossary linked to business assets that are linked to data scientists, or the ability to find data and then to be able to request access to the data, and then to have a sandbox in which that data can be analyzed. I've seen a massive uptake in that area where tools like Calibra, and I think even Axon has that, Paul, if I'm correct, where you can search on the data and then you can say, okay, I'm interested in this. I describe the purpose that I'm using it for, and then I get a copy of the data set that's either obfuscated or aggregated, whichever level, and I can start making use of that. Now that's where I believe the business really starts to get value from that platform.
Okay. If you can share that out, that'll be good.
Okay, I certainly can. So I developed, that's actually quite interesting. I developed for that last week, I shared on something like those 5,000 time series. We then went through a whole process of cataloging it. And I built that conceptual model of remember Kimball had that recipe, the cooking recipe for BI. And then he built that idea of having a menu. And so I used a similar idea to have a menu of time series. And I allowed people, so we added lots of different tags to the different time series, and then we make use of a multifaceted taxonomy, which allowed the user to draw through whichever taxonomy they wanted. So is it geographic? Is it an economic concept? Is it a whatever concept they are, and allow them to get to the data assets? And I found they really enjoyed that approach. Okay, so I've got Thomas.
Yeah, so Anthony, maybe just one from my side that might help you sell or justify is we've seen something like impact analysis, which is the flip side of data lineage, save us lots of time and therefore lots of money. If you've got, now that typically only happens once you've invested quite a bit, because to get the lineage done properly requires a lot of effort. But once that is in, you can very quickly get to grips as to what the cost will be for a system change or a system enhancement. We've seen what we've done help a lot there. So that was just one thought that I had when Anthony was talking. The other I wanted to kind of mention is there are one or two open source or cheapish metadata platforms. I'm trying to think of one now, but the one that comes to mind is Talent Open Studio.
Right.
Doesn't really work well when you have to scale, but there's ways around it. But that's a good starting point for smaller enterprises, or if you want to get your hands dirty to understand what metadata can do for you, because it's cheap or free, really, depending on which one you take.
Oh. So that sort of comes to. I just wanted to link that to what Mark asked: is how do you become an expert within metadata? And the thing that I really learned is when I spent, it was almost like 2 or 3 months that I had to build a meta model within CaseWise to contain all of the information about data quality. That was a really exciting process where I had to jump up and down constantly in my head between a data model of the data asset, a meta model of the data quality domain, and then a meta model that I had to link within CaseWise. So CaseWise had a series of high-level elements that I had to then say, how do I link data quality into this, and how do I describe or inherit a data quality profile or a data quality dimension? Those type of things that I had to add on and then bring it all in within that area. So I like the Talent Open that data platform. I used it quite a bit in terms of data quality profiling, and so that was encouraging. But I really felt that when I finally understood the power of metadata was when I started building the meta models and linking the two together, and to be able to say, I've got this information schema in a database, I've got this data asset, and then if I parse through a Power BI XML file, I can look at the data connections, I can look at the data fields, and how do I bring all of this together in one meta model of where my moving parts are? That taught me a lot. And then Mark, the next thing is going into that level of ontology of using structures like that to describe the domain that you can make use to classify data and allocate as metadata when you're coming in. So that's sort of the path that I've experienced in terms of both from describing data and then describing knowledge and providing a map of the world that you live in.
Yeah, and if your typical next step after that is you start enabling things like semantic discovery.
Yes.
Because you've done the hard work of classifying and tagging all of these things. Now you can get the computer to brute force its way through that and start linking things together for you that you then just say yay or nay. It does all the hard work, and you just say, well, these two things are actually the same. It gives you that capability of doing a little bit of discovery that is always a fun bit to do.
And I also like that, Thomas, when you go into a knowledge graph database, and then you ingesting documents into the knowledge graph, or even interesting, you can even ingest a relational database into a knowledge graph, and then you go through the process of typing the typing becomes almost your metadata or your knowledge component that then gets associated with attributes or elements within the nodes and the links. And so it's that ongoing progression, and then the ability to type and to define a deeper level, which makes this all become real, because you can then ingest more data and then say, well, what does this document tell me about this concept? And then I can start building a library and things like that. Anthony, I see your hands up.
Yeah, just another thing what I picked up, and just your view on it, is that I picked up that metadata and lineage is so closely knitted.
Yeah.
And it actually makes sense, especially when, after the, from a catalog perspective, you have your whole metadata, and then you're drawing a lineage between the different source systems and so forth, both from a front end and all the way going down all the way to the lake. Tools, when you're looking from a tool set perspective, do you look at tool sets that can offer both capabilities, or use separate tools for each of them? And yeah, what's your view on that, Howard?
Oh, shucks, what I have found is that there's so many different approaches that people have. For example, best of breed, so using something like Solidatus, or going the Informatica route that has everything. And so I tend to think the answer is a sort of organizational cultural one, which one they choose. What I like to do is that ability to have that independence and choose the right tool, and then use the metadata repository with the metadata model to link all of this data.
Okay, thanks for that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, Mark, your comment, Mark, is, for example, Informatica deals with just about everything. I think Calibra is sort of catching up on some of those things, where it associates data quality. It can do, and it's built a lot of trawlers to go and pick up metadata from the different metadata sources, and it itself is becoming a metadata hub. And I'm sure Informatica's got a similar approach to that.
Yeah, I just want to add to that is, I remember when we did the master data management talks as well, how it's together. I mean, a big theme there was you almost don't call it MDM. If you can call it something else, you're on the right track.
Yeah.
In the sense that
you're right. I actually built a proof of concept, in terms of the project. Before you go and do a business case, you do a proof of concept. And I built that menu system that Kimball had for all the data and the BI, and showed people how to navigate. And that came off the back of a 6-month exercise where they got in a management consultant. They went and cataloged all the data. And it's a case of, now we've done all this great stuff, but now we've lost it. So what is the use? Now, just bringing that data in and visualizing that data for the business people was phenomenal in their ability to say, oh, shucks, so you have this data. And when I could classify the data with business concepts, so I used the business concepts of the what, where, and I labeled all of this data that we had brought together, then all of a sudden the lights went on, and then they said, my goodness, for the first time I've been able to have some understanding of the data we have in our organization, because everyone worked department by department, and they never really understood what the other guy had on the other side. They felt that they should have it, but they didn't understand exactly what they did have.
Yeah. If you can find a real reason for doing it, I mean, so let's take Papaya. I mean, it's a big thing at the moment. But if you can have something where you can break up, for example, Papaya into its different bits, and you can clearly your policies that deals with those things, and just have a sort of a map. I mean, that's really good reason to do, but it's a way of doing metadata, or one aspect of it. But things like that makes it real. So whether it's looking at whether we are not Papaya compliant from a data management perspective, obviously that needs to come in. But just, do I have the policies that actually speaks to the regulation, things like this?
Yes.
And then, okay, so let's build out from that idea. what data sets do I now have that's related to this policy that's actually linked to that data set, regulation? Who's the ownership? What systems are involved? So that's what something like Axon is good at, or maybe Calibra and one of those things. It's about the different facets.
Yes.
For any given topic that you're basically building a graph database under the hood.
It's called a multifaceted taxonomy. Yeah, but you got to. I think that the important thing is that we can bring this stuff together.
Yes.
So we don't just want to have a repository for data models, or just a repository for ETL, or a repository for glossary, or a repository for documents. How do we build that meta model that starts to find the relationships between this metadata that we're collecting?
Yes, and how friendly is it to get there? You know.
Yeah. Now, I mean, these knowledge graphs and the visualizations on that is amazing. But it's a good point you bring in, because we applied some AI to quite a bit of data using a graph database, and I'm sure you've heard of me talk about the butterfly effect. When we looked at the output of that data, it was just like this amorphous mass that they would show the movement of the data, and it looked like a butterfly, and that's all you could discern. Now, as soon as we went to the next level, where we took the property graph to a knowledge graph and we added typing, the user could say, please show me all of those companies that are group companies and they have a relationship with other companies in other countries. Now, all of that is a typing thing, and all of a sudden, that data that was collected was phenomenal in terms of answering businesses' questions about associations between companies. What were they doing? What was their company structure look like, and things like that. That was that to me, it was another one of those things of saying, shucks, I can just throw buckets full of data at a graph database, and it's really fantastic. I can take the whole of Wikipedia and put it in there, but unless I can have some level of taxonomy or structural way of which I can navigate what I've got, I find it hard. I can just find some interesting possible correlations, but
yeah, it's like the Google search box. It's the ultimate sophistication, right? So
yeah. That's exactly what you're looking at. If I can,
you have to find easy entry place into it, and then navigate sensibly. It's not easy, but I think if that kind of thing is a driver, it helps to structure a random mind like mine as well. I see Jan mentioned too that I actually wasn't aware of this, and I was wondering if you could comment on it. Jan, have you played with it, or can you recommend it? Sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot if you don't want to speak. I am checking that out on the web now. It looks interesting. Did you know about this, Howard?
The data governance open source solution.
Yeah.
I'm surfing it now too. My client has Informatica, but it's such a beast. My client is getting Calibra, but it's such a beast.
Yeah.
I need metadata light on steroids. How's that? I don't know what I need.
Yeah, look, it's so again, the only thing I really have my hands a bit dirty on is the Informatica suite, and to get those things installed it's a couple of days work, you know, and it's because under the hood to be able to cover all the different facets, deal with database schema trawlers and ETL trawlers, up until querying data quality products and all that, to link all those things and to make it presentable, and to make it searchable. You actually have a relational database, a graph database, and an Elasticsearch component in there, all under the hood. And in fact, what they've done is under the hood, you've got a full Hadoop cluster and a graph database, and there's four things: a graph database, a Hadoop cluster, Elasticsearch, and relational database. And all of that needs to be presented in a clean way, and they need to work together.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to get these things installed unless you go for a cloud version or something like that. But it's because it's a complex. Metadata is really complex, and to make it clean is really difficult from a product perspective. So I'm really interested in TrueDat.
Yeah.
And what can,
I
mean, you can't install something like Axon, which is just it's a business glossary on steroids. I'm sure Informatica will kill me if I say that because it's much more and whatever, but you can't install that thing on your laptop. You need a proper server for running it, you know?
No.
Yeah. And is there something smaller to play with? That would be a good question. And it links to, I don't know who asked it, maybe it was you, Mark. How do you become an expert? This is a good question. I was wondering about that. I'm wondering that even if you're not going to do any technical work, implementation work or whatnot, again, for me, it was if I can't play with it and make it tangible, it's very difficult for me to really make it real. So it's implement something, you know, even if it's small.
Yeah, but that's what I'm sort of suggesting is do the first thing of building a meta model that allows you to bring in multiple sources of metadata and find the relationships and link those two together. So how do you create a meta model of two different areas? You're starting to go through the process of unifying. You're starting to go through the process of defining categories and taxonomies that will help you describe the data.
Yeah, that's a good engineering approach that you have for an engineer.
That sounds pretty hardcore. I won't even do that now. I would go buy one. I just definitely won't try and make one. So I have an opposite view. I would say, and I mean it's personal, right? You know, from my point of view, if I had to start there, I would probably not still be in the field. I think that's just too much for me to. Like I said, I probably won't even do that now yet. For me, the cool thing was getting to a point where I can see lineage and stuff. That to me immediately made sense.
Yeah.
I could sell that easily enough to a business user.
Yeah, I suppose where I'm coming from, Thomas, is the question is, how do I, as a professional, become a metadata specialist? And
true. I get what you're saying. Sorry, yeah, I misunderstood.
So
I think the trick is practice, like everything.
Yeah.
But
it's stretching yourself into that meta modeling, the taxonomies, the ontologies, that building of that sort of graph, that those interactions, the multifaceted taxonomies. When you start doing that, it's amazing how much you learn about metadata.
Yeah. No, it is something it's there, but it's under the covers, right? Until you click and then you realize how much of it is there. But yeah, I think even now, if you had to tell me build a unified meta model, I'd be sweating.
Yeah. Look, I mean, and I suppose the challenge we have is that we then tend to live with these silos of the metadata.
Yeah, true.
And we then very siloed about which one tool can do that one thing. And we then fall into the thing of saying, well, let's get a tool that does everything.
Which business likes but doesn't exist.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. No, I think I might have been spoiled. That's the problem. I might have been spoiled in my career.
Any, Paul?
No, I just wanted to say the TrueDat looks interesting, but you can't download anything. You have to contact them. So it seems like it's built on open source components, but the thing itself doesn't seem to be open source.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But also, there's Mark. I don't know if the other things you can look at is go and spend some time with the European data platform, open data platform. It's got something called the DCAT, the data cataloging standard. It's actually called DCAT/AP. It gives you quite a bit of learning and tells you why the metadata is so important, what the standard is, how do we catalog data. And that's quite a nice way of describing data that more and more tools are coming out with. So those
Yeah,
are really nice approaches to saying, well, how are you going to solve the problem without going super large or super big?
Well, yeah, my client they have Informatica, but they're new to it, and they have Calibra, but they're new to it. Like, they're just standing it up. So I can't wait till Christmas. And it's a big shop, so it takes months to get things installed. And I'm not officially part of those teams. So I go sniffing around, and it's like, stay out of my closet. That's my stuff. So I want to do my own thing. Right. And listen, guys, another great session. I'm sure glad I dialed in today. I will see you next week, I hope.
Excellent. Thank you.
I have to pop off and
cheers, Mark. Have a good one. So, Connie, to answer your question, the second question is easy for me to answer. The DCAT AP standard, and that's whenever you're going to unify metadata, you need a common standard. And that allows them to send these distributed queries to all of the governments that contribute to the data in the European Open Data Platform. So it can go to Greece and say, so what that does mean is there's not this, it's that sort of distributed, it's actually a hybrid version where they don't bring everything together, and lots of the times they send the queries to the different metadata repositories in the different countries. So Sparkle and DCAT, and you can use to query that. And then when you talk about the question, do you use ontologies only for meta modeling or also for data modeling? And so the answer is they're actually used for both. If you think of FIBO, that then is pushed down to FibDM. So if they use the FIBO ontology to build the FIBO data model in ERDs and things like that, they actually use the ontology as a source, and they create the data models. So you actually use it for both. The one I like to do it, and the most experience I've got, is applying that to the data typing within a graph database. And then I started to see so I almost went from the graphs to a taxonomy with structures, and then the multifaceted taxonomy, and then the ontology. That was a sort of journey along that learning path. Guys, thank you very much. It's been excellent. I really enjoy the discussion. It was nice. I'm glad you guys have lots of questions about metadata. I think it's one of the most exciting areas of data management at the moment, and I think Connie's right in terms of that semantic modeling, the semantic web, what it's going to do for us, how it's going to be used for knowledge management, all these different areas, the ability to almost remove the separation of metadata and data into all being living together. And that's what I think is important. Right, yes, Anthony, what I will do is I'll actually share the slide deck at the end of the month where I have all of them together. What I do find is I actually learn about, for example, on data citizenship, I enhance some of the screens. So at the end of Thursday's one, we'll ship the deck.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Guys, thanks very much. Thomas, thanks for your interaction. Anthony, thanks, guys. Paul, PG, thank you very much.
Thanks, Howard. Excellent. Looking forward to next week.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Yes, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers.